Today is going to be a short session because I want to talk about this is a course about environmental inequalities or environmental justice. And there's a particular historical moment where environmental justice became a national issue. And so I want to kind of locate in time and place for you the time that both activists and social science researchers discovered environmental inequality. And by environmental inequality, we originally meant that in the United States, where the movement starts, environmental hazards, mostly exposure to toxic chemicals, was unevenly distributed in the population. That because of where people worked and where they lived, people of color and poor people were much more likely to be situated near places of concentrations of hazardous industrial chemicals. So that's the big theme of the course. As I said, both a social movement and a whole tradition, a new tradition of social science research, and more as well. So I want to first go over the beginnings of the environmental justice understandings in American society, how people became aware of it, and then do some administrative matters, go over the syllabus, talk about the paper, talk about the exams, talk about grading, things like that. And I also want to talk about enrollment. So before I go any further, can I see a show of hands of anybody who's here who is not registered for the class? So there are a couple, and I don't know at the moment if there is room in the class, but in order to kind of assess whether there is room, I'm going to ask the TAs to pass out these little 3x5 cards.
Just the people who...
Everybody. Everybody gets cards. And this is the last time, unlike 100, the last time you'll be filling out cards. So, but what I want on these cards is the following. One, print your name. And I say print because most people's cursive is increasingly illegible. It used to be only doctors' signatures couldn't be read, but now, since everybody essentially grows up typing, nobody can write anymore. So block lettering, please, last name, first name. If you are enrolled, and don't complete filling these out until we're done, because there's going to be two kinds of enrolled students. People who are enrolled and at the end of this preliminary lecture want to continue. And there might be some people I'm allowing who will listen to me for the next hour and decide they've had enough and want to go to a different class. So you put down your name, and if you're enrolled, put down enrolled, and then as we leave, before you give us the card, write down, I'm staying or I'm leaving. And for people who are not enrolled but would like to be in the class, and there's a couple more people who might need cards over here, just came in. Please write down whether you're a sophomore, junior, or senior, whether you've fulfilled the prerequisite of the Environmental Studies Department, taking 100, and any special reasons you would have.
I'll just write on the board the...
Okay, good. Thank you. Any special reasons you might have if we do not have enough empty seats for you in the class. Is that clear? Everybody's clear on that? Everybody have a card? Okay, great. And we'll collect those cards. Please be sure to leave them at the end of the session. So, I'll turn this little gizmo on, and today's the January 8th. And we start out with, where does the notion of environmental justice come from? And it comes from a particular protest that happened in Warren County, North Carolina in the early 1980s. Involved a protest against the proposed siting of a hazardous waste landfill. A lot of this is described in that article that I asked you to read by Geiser and Wannock. Here's some more people just came in who will need some cards. And I'll be nice today and not yell at people, but if you're going to be in this class, please make sure to be here on time. So the story here involves a particular class of chemicals called polychlorinated biphenyls, and I'm going to go into some detail that I'm not going to hold you responsible for. Just listen to the story. As you read in that piece, PCBs are a very useful industrial substance, but they're also quite dangerous to the human body. So there was a law passed in 1976 called the Toxic Substances Control Act, often called TSCA, which basically identified a whole bunch of very hazardous chemicals. Federal government said there are some things that are being produced and distributed that are so dangerous that you cannot simply landfill them once you're done. You can't just throw them in the ground, but you have to dispose of them safely, either in a high-tech landfill or through incineration. And incineration at a high enough temperature that the substance breaks down. And so what do we know about PCBs? We know, first of all, that they are very useful industrially, and as Geiser and Wannock say, they're virtually indestructible, part of the problem in disposing of them. They are chemically inert, heat-resistant, non-flammable, and electrically non-conducting, which is what makes them very useful in electrical insulators and other things. They are present and they are insulators, but they don't interact very well with any, they don't burn. And they're used in transformers and capacitors, also have been used in pesticides, copying paper, adhesives, sealants, and plastics. A very wide range of uses. Many thousands of pounds, hundreds of thousands of pounds of this stuff were produced, and because they don't interact very well with anything, they're persistent in the environment. And the EPA has found that 90% of the world's population, probably 100% of us in this room, have perceptible amounts of PCBs in our bodies. At high enough concentrations, PCBs are shown to be carcinogenic, toxic to the liver, and to interfere with reproduction. So it's everywhere, and it could be hazardous. So that's why TSCA, the federal government, declared that these things must be incinerated. And they have to be incinerated. They're so stable, they have to be incinerated at 2,000 degrees centigrade or higher. Which is a very, very expensive operation. So what happened is that there was, on the East Coast, for many years, I don't know what the situation now, but 20, 30 years ago, organized crime was involved in hazardous waste disposal. And we think about organized crime like the Godfather movies, and numbers running and prostitution and drugs, and we never think of them as moving garbage. But it turns out that it's a very profitable enterprise, the way they did it. And so mobsters and others engaged in a process of what eventually got to be called midnight dumping. So here's TSCA. And all of these, when I project stuff here, you can also find it on Canvas before the lecture. We'll talk more about what PCBs are, but the phenomenon of midnight dumping. which PCBs are in liquid form often, and so you can fill a tanker truck with them. Congressional testimony finds that on a nice wet night you can drive a big truck into the rural areas of a state. Roads little traveled, you can open up the bottom of the truck and empty out the truck's worth of PCBs in about 8 minutes, and then drive away and cost you nothing. These are pictures of some PCBs, a whole family, it's not one chemical, a whole family of molecules. What characterizes them all is that they don't exist in nature. So these little hexagons are parts of organic molecules, carbon, oxygen, hydrogen. In nature, you never have a chlorine atom attached to an organic molecule. These are produced in the laboratory. They are made by human beings, and they turned out to be very, very useful, not only PCBs, but DDT, pesticides, so turned out to be very useful in certain ways. By the way, some other people came in. They're going to need cards as well. If you're interested in the whole phenomenon of chlorinated hydrocarbons, there's a whole book that's been written about them, Pandora's Poison, which I think is a brilliant book. It's certainly disturbing. It shows that human beings can make all kinds of substances that are, in short run, useful for agriculture, useful for industry. Turns out to be very dangerous for the human body and probably other species as well. So the subtitle, Chlorine Health and the New Environmental Strategy. The other thing that you might want to look up, my friend Rebecca Altman has written a series of articles about environmental science, and this one appeared just last year, or 2017, which is, as she says, the benzene tree. So these are essentially start out as oil extracted from the ground and then chemically altered for various kinds of uses, similar to what they do with plastics. So you might want to, if you want to go. And then throughout the quarter, I'm going to be showing you references and selections, should any of you want to look deeper into some of the things that we talk about. So, what happened with this particular instance of midnight dumping? I wish I could show you the video I have. It doesn't seem to play on this particular machine. But in North Carolina, one night, 6 truckloads of PCBs got turned in one night into 6,000 truckloads of contaminated soil. Now, it's hard enough to burn liquid PCBs in concentrated form. Unimaginable to try to burn 6,000 truckloads of contaminated soil. So suddenly the local environmental officials and EPA said, okay, well, we've got to do something about this. And so the only logical thing is to put it in a landfill, dig a big hole in the ground, put it in a, cover it up. And they proposed to put this new PCB-laden landfill in Warren County. Now, Warren County is the poorest county in the state of North Carolina, which is at that point the poorest state in the Union. It was also 65% African American. And so, which is one of very high concentration of minorities, and a local protest broke out to resist the siting of this landfill. And here's some pictures. I'm going to show you some pictures of the protests, led by these two guys here. An African-American minister of a local United Church of Christ church, a longtime activist in the civil rights movement, and Ken Ferruccio, who was a sociology professor at a local community college. So from the beginning, an interracial coalition of local citizens opposed to the landfill. Here they are again marching down the street together. Dr. Ben Chavis, the head of the NAACP, comes in, so it's got the endorsement of a national civil rights organization. People lay down, classic civil rights protest, laying down in front of trucks who are coming in to begin to construct the landfill. People being carried away and arrested by the local police as they protest. So let's see what else we can say. Let's watch this video. Let me see if I can bring it up for you, which gives you a sense of what these protests were like. And if I set the volume too loud, we'll have to adjust it.
We will not allow one county to become a dump site.
The State Highway Patrol began moving in on...
I don't know why we can't hear it. Okay, the sound does not work. That's okay, just watch the visuals. Okay, I guess it won't work. No, turn that thing off.
choice but to make the arrest if they were going to move the people out of the way and get the trucks in here. One protester jumped in front of the first truck and was quickly hustled away. In all, 10 trucks arrived for the first dumping. As they unloaded the PCB soil in the landfill,
that's the PCB contaminated soil.
stop protesters and to store PCB here.
We were hoping that we were going to have, of course, just a protest.
That's a local official telling people to behave themselves. That always happens, you know. It's like, if you're nice, they ignore you, and if you are more militant and disruptive, then they tell you that you're acting inappropriately, and you should write your local officials. All right, let's get back to our slideshow. So that is the protest. It was a huge protest. It was the biggest civil rights protest since the time of Martin Luther King. There were 550 arrests, and this protest went on for quite a long amount of time. And this is the beginnings of the environmental justice movement. And from there, the movement goes off in two different directions, which are going to be 2/3 of the material that we're going to be covering in this course. So as I will describe to you presently, our course will be divided into 3 modules or segments. One segment will be devoted to environmental justice research. One segment will be about the environmental justice movement. And then the third one, which I'm going to be describing. And so, first of all, the movement, which we're going to be talking about last in the course, and I want to emphasize that as we leave, because typically most environmental studies courses are very depressing, right? I mean, you know, you're like young and healthy and looking forward to a long life of work and love. And then the professors come along and tell you that you're going to be living in an increasingly stressed, toxic, and degraded world. Never a good... It's true. I mean, I'm not going to come out here and like tell you fake news, right? Unfortunately, that is the reality that you're going to be facing and my 3 children are going to be facing. But it's also true that people have fought back and have won significant battles over the years. And so it's really good to end not with a sense of helplessness, but with a sense of empowerment that it is possible to fight collectively for better circumstances. So the environmental justice movement, here is a map of the U.S. Put together by an environmental justice scholar, Bob Bullard, which, it's a little bit out of date, but Bullard tried to show the spread of local environmental justice activism, which involved here in the South and this part of the country a lot of movements based on African Americans. Out here in this part of the South and California, lots of Latino conflicts, much of it over pesticide exposures for people working in agriculture. Native Americans out here, mostly fighting about being exposed to mine tailings, so mining operations in and near Indian reservations, which result in lots and lots of material being pulled out of the ground but left on site. They're not really the ores that people are looking for, but other rocks and minerals that turn out to be often contaminated with heavy metals and other toxic substances. So we're going to be looking at the whole history of the environmental justice movement since Warren County, but we're also going to go back a little ways, because if you think about environmental justice as not just today's people of color being exposed to toxic materials, but you think about it as the more broad question of class, social class, as well as race and ethnicity, then you can look back and see that there were much earlier environmental and social conflicts and struggles that we can now retroactively also think of as environmental justice. And we're going to look at that. The environmental justice perspective is that the environment is not just beautiful redwood trees and not just endangered species like whales and pandas, but it's also the human environment. So the environmental justice perspective says that cities are environments. And right now, 50% of humankind, at least, and probably more, live in cities. And very few of them hike in Yosemite National Park. So the environment for them is the place where they live. Also, workplaces are environments. Factories are environments. So one of the things we're going to do when we look at the history of the environmental activism is go back to the 19th century, where American workers first fought for the 10-hour day, and then fought for the 8-hour day, and fought for healthier workplace conditions so that they could work in a factory and not be maimed or pulled into fast-moving machinery or lose their hearing or be overheated or be injured in some particular way. So a whole labor history can be reconsidered environmental justice history, as working people fought for shorter hours, healthier working conditions. Also in the 19th century, there was a big movement, which people know even less about, to clean up the modern American city, the industrial city. Cities even today are many places not that pleasant. Even a booming kind of Silicon Valley influenced town like San Francisco, gentrifying as it is and unaffordable as it is, are places where there's parts of San Francisco that are pretty tough to go into physically. There's not enough public transportation, there's too much garbage, but compared to the 19th century city, the modern American city is like paradise. There were pigs roaming the streets, dogs, horses dying by the thousands because they were used in horse-drawn carriages and so forth. Conditions in American City were abysmal. People were getting sick from the bad drinking water. There wasn't decent garbage removal. So there was a whole movement in the late 19th century to make the city more livable, less of a health hazard. And that, too, from the environmental justice perspective, can be considered an environmental justice movement. So we're going to look at the movement more broadly and more historically than just looking at what happens after Warren County. And then we turn to the question of research. So that's going to be a third of the course. And then research. So there was an early question as sociologists, political scientists, economists begin to look at Warren County, look at the movement, look at the evidence that people are, that class and race inequalities are not just a question of education, jobs, housing, but is also a question of environmental exposure. And they asked a question. The question was, is there a pattern? Or was it Warren County unique? If it turns out that Warren County was a one-off kind of thing, where this one community was cited for the PCB landfill, then that's not a topic for social science research. It's just unhappiness for that particular community. But if it turns out that that is typical of what happens in the rest of the country, then it's worthwhile studying in greater depth. So a couple of studies were done fairly early on. So there's this thing called the General Accounting Office, the USGAO, which is Congress's research arm. If any of you like doing policy-related research, you should consider going to work for the GAO. They produce incredibly good studies on foreign policy, on economic policy, environment, whatever Congress gets involved with, their studies. So there was a representative of Congress who asked the GAO to say, take not just Warren County, but the 4 largest commercial hazardous waste landfills in the South, and look at the demographic characteristics of those 4 landfills. And here's what they found. Here's the list of the landfills, chemical waste management. By the way, Waste Management, Inc. is also the company that removes our garbage here in the city of Santa Cruz. It's the biggest national garbage hauler probably in the world. SCA Services, Industrial Chemicals, and then finally Warren County Landfill. And they asked the question about population, what percentage of the population is African American? It turns out a high of 90%, a low of 38%, which is still much larger than the national average. And then median family income, population below the poverty level, that's also African American, 90%, 92%, 100%, 100%. So this was evidence that Warren County was fairly typical of the other large commercial hazardous waste landfills. So strong evidence that we're dealing with something that's systemic. And then there was a second study that was done by the United Church of Christ. United Church of Christ is kind of a liberal Protestant church, primarily African American. They have a commission for racial justice. And the minister who was involved in Warren County was had a UCC church. And so the national UCC decided to do a study. And it's a very primitive study. Initially, they took these very large areas, zip codes, and they divided the country into 4 different types of zip codes. Ones that were clean, that had no hazardous waste hauling, storage, disposal. Ones that had only one such facility, and then versus ones that were either had some of the largest commercial facilities or had more than one. And here is their finding. So the residential communities, zip codes that had no operating commercial hazardous waste treatment had a 12% minority. And category 4 is zip codes that have one of the 5 largest hazardous waste landfills or more than one, had almost 40% minorities. So again, this is proof that Warren County is typical and is representative of a nationwide pattern. So that means that there's something to understand, there's something to study, and then that unleashes a whole group of social scientists, sociologists, economists, political scientists, to take a deeper look at the whole phenomenon of unequal exposure, phenomenon of environmental inequalities. And so those are the two of the 3 topics. The third topic, and I want to spend just a minute talking about that because it might be to you a little bit more mysterious, is, and this is what we're going to start out with, environmental justice as a meta-narrative. So, what is a meta-narrative? Okay, so how do I talk about this? Okay, I think this is the way. So, human beings have always been interested in what makes us unique in the animal world. People are obsessed with it. You know, we want to be special, we want to be different. And so philosophers have long talked about, like, you know, what makes us different than dogs and cats and earthworms. And lots of different answers have come, you know, like, well, because we're smarter, or we have language, or we have opposable thumbs. But one of the ones I'm attracted to is that we live by telling stories. Human beings are storytellers about their own experience. As individuals, we tell stories about ourselves. We tell it to others. You know, when you first start dating somebody and you have those first awkward, somewhat trying kind of first dates, and you show a little bit about yourself, only the best parts, right? Only the parts that'll get you a second date. And maybe some of the other less desirable parts get, you know, like the crazy parents. Everybody has crazy parents, but everyone thinks that it's something to be ashamed of, as opposed to the human condition, which all parents are neurotic, of course. And we all have troubles with them. So people tell stories to others. And that's a question of your social identity. Sociologists talk about how people lay claim to a certain perception of self that they want to present to others, and that can be clothing. It can be personal adornments like tattoos, facial hair. It can be what people talk about. You know, because what people talk about, if you want to talk about your favorite TV show, or the kind of music you love, or the kind of ideas that you are particularly attracted to, you are not just revealing something, but you are laying claim to a particular narrative about who you are, that you want others to understand, that this is what matters to you in life, and perhaps they're going to be sharing that with you. We also do that internally. We tell stories not only to others, we tell stories to ourselves. People constantly are narrating their own lives. When they have memories of childhood, when they have memories of good things that happened to them or not so good, when they think about the future, which only exists in one's imagination, right? It hasn't happened yet, but every one of us has this overarching narrative of our lives. This is who we were, this is where we come from, this is the family we were born in, this is who I am right now, This is who I hope to be sometime in the future. And when people don't have that sense of narrative, the story that they tell themselves, sometimes people, they get committed to mental hospitals. They're confused. They don't know who they are anymore at that particular moment. And it causes them anxiety. It causes all kinds of trouble. So we tell stories to others. We tell stories to ourselves. We also tell stories about collectivities. We tell stories about society, who we are as a society. And social scientists tell stories too. And when they tell really big stories, they tell meta-narratives. There's these overarching concepts of what explains social life. And those can be stories about the progress of human history. We are incredibly inventive. New things are developed by very smart people. We are growing as a population. These days, people talk about the Anthropocene, that we have actually moved from the contemporary kind of geological period that we were in since the last ice age, and we're into a new historical period in which human beings have totally taken over the planet and reshaped it, not always for the best purposes, but definitely humanized not only our social life but our whole planet. So meta-narratives can be about a big story about all of human history. A meta-narrative can also be about a somewhat smaller, like a particular time, like the history of sociologists really interested in the history of modernity. Like, what is modern social life as distinguished from what came before in the Middle Ages, or what was even before that in Roman Greece, or what was even before that as when we were nothing but hunter-gatherers. So you can have, meta-narratives are big encompassing concepts that say that they say something deeply true about the essence of a particular time in human history. So it's about deep truth. It's about essences. So you can have an overarching framework, and you can have it very big, like about all of social history, or you can have it about modernity. And so environmental inequalities, I will argue to you, and I will hopefully prove it to you over the next 5 sessions. So during the first part of this course, will be about how environmental inequality functions as a meta-narrative. And how would we do that? Just to give you a little preview, I think environmental inequality works as a narrative, not for all, but for most of human history. And why is that? Well, we have to look at the conditions. There are 2 conditions that have to exist for there to be a phenomenon of environmental inequality in any society. The first condition is human beings have to be exploiting nature, extracting materials from nature, transforming nature. And the second phenomenon is there has to be social inequality. Okay, the first condition is always met. Human beings, as far as we can establish through archaeology, have always extracted materials from nature and transformed nature in an active way. I mean, we can see burial plots, we can see the phenomenon of people, fire. You know, the early people used fire extensively to alter the environment to make it more favorable, to create, for instance, to burn forests so that more fruit-bearing bushes would grow, and that would attract deer, and then the deer could be hunted and could be eaten. So all the archaeological evidence suggests that going back as far as people have evidence, we don't know the language they spoke, we don't know a lot about their everyday life, but we can see the physical evidence of human beings in small groups transforming nature in significant ways. Human beings have always transformed nature. And then the question is, well, what societies are characterized by the existence of inequalities? The answer is hunter-gatherer. So we were, until about 8,000 years ago, give or take 1,000 years, when human beings all over the world discovered or invented agriculture and herding, so that we learned to systematically kind of possess our food-producing abilities, and therefore began to settle down into the first little towns and villages, which ultimately would grow into cities. It's a really recent phenomenon. Until then, from the beginning of whatever the proto-human species was, which is what, 500,000 years ago, roughly, until about 8,000 years ago, we lived as hunter-gatherers. And one of your first selections is Marshall Solomons' article about what the life of the hunter-gatherers were like. So we're going to talk about that probably in a couple days. To all evidence, as you will read, hunter-gatherers were egalitarian societies. There was not a whole lot of differentiation, not a whole lot of wealth. People are on the go. They haven't perfected the creating a surplus in food. So they gathered food and they ate it, they hunted it. They're not very good at preserving anything, so if you hunt some meat, you eat it. And if there's not a lot of surplus, then there's not a lot of conditions for opportunities for hoarding wealth, for taking the surplus, and some people having more of it and others people having none or less. There was some division of labor between males and females, the evidence shows. Perhaps some beginnings of differentiation according to status. Some people had better reputations than others. But these were small, relatively homogeneous groups on the go. Not a lot of inequalities, but all other societies since then have been characterized by inequalities. Okay, one more minute. We talk about the discovery of history. And what does this mean? It might be odd for someone to say we discovered history in the 19th century, because we've been living history as a species, right, from the beginning. But in fact, in terms of intellectual understanding of the spread of human beings and the growth of societies and cultures, it really wasn't until the 19th century that we really began to understand human history. And it's sort of similar to what happened with the sciences of species and evolution. There was a time, until fairly recently, that people believed that the species that they saw around them were the species created by the good Lord 6,000 years ago. And they're still around as they were originally formed. And then people began to dig up fossils. And slowly it began to dawn on them that there used to be creatures living on the earth that are now extinct. And slowly the whole idea of evolution over time, over deep time, that the earth was not 6,000 years old, but 4 billion years old. And that life started evolving a long time ago, and there were extinctions, and so that slowly dawns on them. And people used to think that the weather of the earth was relatively stable, and then they began to have evidence of ice ages. And they began to rethink the history of the earth as one that changes climactically over time, and sometimes very dramatically. So it's similar with the human history. There were a couple of things that happened in the 19th century that made people begin to think about history as a dynamic and changing thing. One thing was the better understanding of the fall of former civilizations. So people better understood that Greece was a great civilization, that Rome was a great civilization, and that there were these fantastic works of art and culture and philosophy, and then suddenly these things ceased to exist. And therefore, there are these flowerings of human culture that suddenly are no longer. just a little bit of evidence here and there that you take and put them into museums. And then the other thing that happened in the 19th century was that intellectuals are witnessing the collapse of the old feudal order. You know, feudalism had been in place for 1,000 years. Kings and landlords and farming and all that stuff, peasants. And they were being rapidly replaced by industry and urbanization. Tremendous amount of social change. The world that we know, urban industrial capitalism, was a world that was being actively created as people witnessed it in the 19th century. And when people see such huge historical changes, they begin to think about, well, you know, oh, maybe there's different kinds of society. Maybe we can have periods. And this whole notion of periodization begins to appear. One particular version was the one proposed by Karl Marx. It said that there were like 4 periods in human history. The first one that he called tribal society, sometimes called it primitive communism, which looked kind of like, well, the very earliest anthropological studies that he based his ideas on kind of looked like what we now think of as hunter-gatherers or Native Americans before Europeans invaded. Then he said, well, there was a period where societies are based on slave labor, so looking at Greece and Rome, then feudalism based on recent European history, and then finally the birth of capitalism based on eyewitness observation of what was happening then. A more contemporary division, a simpler one, which we're going to be using, is to divide human history into, I mean, there's no mystery about these stages, and there's no great agreement. There's other people who created 5 stages. So the idea is not to remember that this particular sequence, but that there are periods where for a long time human beings behave in a certain way. Their institutions are stable, their economic and political institutions. And then there's a period of transition where a new social form is born. And then that's stable for a while. And then there is another kind of transitional period. And so the simplified model is that there was that earlier period of hunter-gatherers that yielded at a particular time. So we were coming out of the last ice age, and temperatures worldwide were becoming warm, and finally they stabilized. And they stabilized enough that people could then tend to believe that conditions were understandable, and they could begin to domesticate cereal crops, begin to grow legumes, begin to herd animals. And so you have the birth of agricultural societies, feudalism, which we understand quite well, being a subset of those, and then finally the transition to the world that we know today. And so that's the basic structure that we're going to be working with. And we're going to be primarily interested in number 3. But we're going to have to start with some of that, some of the earlier stuff. So that's the history we're going to cover of social inequality. But I want to say is that social inequality is also always environmental inequality. Because as human beings who are unequal in wealth and power, and human society is appropriating nature, those people who have the wealth and our power will appropriate the best of nature to themselves. They will have the best food. They will have the nicest houses. And they will leave the less of natural resources to people who are less wealthy and less powerful than they are. So anytime you see social inequalities, there will also be environmental inequalities as well. Those things are like, the image that I have is that they're 2 sides of the same sheet of paper. I mean, you can look at it, so you can talk about social, you can talk about environmental, but it's really part of a single process, inseparable from each other. And so let's see where we are. The argument I have is environmental inequalities are a meta-narrative that's applicable to all human societies since the hunter-gatherers, applicable to human society for the last 8,000 years or so. And it's particularly, as we will see soon, a meta-narrative for understanding modernity. Let's see, let's go past this. And I'll skip that as well. So this is the basic outline then of what we're going to be covering. 3 modules, starting with the meta-narrative, starting with the historical, and then moving on to contemporary research in the social sciences, and then finally looking at environmental movements as environmental justice movements. So let's